Over the last few decades, China has made significant and very rapid economic progress along with raising millions of people out of poverty. Its GDP and GDP per capita have increased exponentially, and just recently, China and Brazil announced a trade deal that would be done in their own currencies rather than in the United States dollar as had been done before, which has triggered no shortage of predictions that the US, given this scenario, dollar might be on the way out and might lose its prominence as the currency of world trade or as the predominant reserve currency now. Against this backdrop, Michael Burry has weighed in and he suggested that China might overtake the United States, may come to dominate the world economy, and the US might lose some prominence. Michael Burry specifically tweeted, "An ascended China seems eerily similar to the Ottomans. Beijing believes that the United States is decadent, undeserving of its affluence, living beyond its means and on the fumes of the past, and very soon will be vulnerable enough." Michael Burry links to an article that goes through some of the arguments for why the United States might lose prominence. Now, many of those arguments are couched in culture wars type terms, and it is worth looking through what that article says, and then talking about China's economy at the moment. The article states, "The last generations of the Byzantines had inherited a global reputation and standard of living. They themselves no longer earned their former civic values, and they fought endless battles over obscure religious texts, doctrines, and vocabulary. They did not expand their anemic army or navy. They did not reunite this gutted Greek-speaking empire. They did not properly maintain their once life-giving wolves instead of earning money through their accustomed non-stop trade. They inflated the currency and were forced down the city's inherited gold and silver fictures. The once canny and shrewd Byzantines grew smug and naive. Childlessness became common. Most now prefer to live outside of what had become a half-empty, often dirty and poorly maintained city. On top of that, they underestimated the growing power of the Ottomans, who had systematically pruned away at the empire. But which 15th century Islamic armies were ready to exploit fatal Byzantine weaknesses? The Sultan mentioned the Second Grand. They announced that the Ottomans were now the real. The only world power ascended Ottoman armies would eventually move on the very gates of Vienna in an effort to rule all the lands of the ancient Roman Empire. China seems similar to the Ottomans, believing that the United States is decadent, undeserving of its affluence, living beyond its means, and very soon will be vulnerable enough to challenge openly. Left and right seem to hate each other more than they do their common enemies. Just like the Byzantines, Americans gave up defending the old borders and simply shrugged as millions overrun as they pleased. Americans similarly believe that they are invincible. Like the Byzantines, Americans have become snarky iconoclasts, more eager to turn down the art and sculpture that they themselves no longer have the talents to create current work. The Byzantines never woke up in time to understand what they had become. So far, neither have Americans, supposed what the article says, leaving other social and cultural comparisons behind in the article. Let's look at the finance and the economics of it and what is going on with China's economy. Now, China has made significant economic strides. Its GDP has increased exponentially. Its tech sector is doing incredibly well. The venture capital sector within China is lively and vibrant, and there's a lot of incredibly innovative startups within China. Furthermore, there's been a ton of growth, and this has lifted millions of people out of poverty. If we look at particular areas within China, well, Hong Kong in particular is incredibly attractive as a place to live and to work. However, with that in mind, it is worth talking about some of the recent developments going on with China's economy, particularly the China-Brazil trade deal. Now this, of course, is done in their own currencies. This led to a lot of hot takes. The US dollar is now going to be in demise, will now no longer be prominent, and won't be the dominant currency trade, nor would it be the current dominant reserve currency. Suddenly, the Chinese yuan has made significant progress into widespread use. However, as Alphonse Peccadillo of the Macro Compass has pointed out, there are some issues with overextending that argument, and in particular, we can look at some of the barriers to do, one becoming a major reserve currency. For example, it isn't freely convertible. It creates some barriers because if you're going to be using the yuan as your reserve currency, because you've got a reserve currency, we need to be able to freely convert it, and capital controls would get in the way of that. Second, there isn't a very liquid or deep or readily accessible bond market within China, at least not compared to the United States. This means that if you're looking for a reserve currency, well, you're kind of stuck with just deposits, which isn't great. You would rather be able to invest in a liquid bond market so you could at least earn some interest when you put your money aside. Furthermore, the current exchange rate isn't really freely floating, not at least to the degree of the United States dollar. And again, this creates issues with being a dominant reserve currency. And then in addition to this, the yuan is not currently used as much for global trade. Now, suddenly there's been progress in this with China and Brazil transacting in that currency. However, it isn't nearly as widespread as the United States dollar. There's progress there, but more progress would be needed for the yuan to dominate the US. Now, this could occur in the future, but it isn't necessarily occurring right now. Besides, if we're looking at just population growth, the article mentions childlessness, indicating the United States has become the country of childlessness, but China's population actually declined. Now, granted, some of this might be due to deaths due to COVID, but nevertheless, it declined in recent years. When it comes to productivity more generally, well, China's productivity growth has really started to trend toward that of the United States. Still a little bit above the United States, but nevertheless is trending toward converging. Certainly, China has risen to prominence and its economy is doing incredibly well. And there are some more steps that could help enhance that economy. However, at the moment, it isn't necessarily displacing the United States right now. But let's talk about China's Belt and Road Initiative. Now here we see the biggest superficial parallel to what's going on in the article. The article suggesting the Ottoman Empire steadily picked away the Byzantine Empire, drawing the edge of the empire out of the Byzantine sphere of influence. By narrative reasoning here, we might assert that China's Belt and Road Initiative is steadily picking away countries from the US sphere of influence, trying to link up money to these countries, and these countries then spend the money on hopefully positive net present value projects that generate economic growth, thereby bringing those countries into China's sphere of influence. However, this doesn't always go according to plan, and many of these loans have reportedly soured, and China's needs make significant bailouts for these countries. Now, on the one hand, if China needs to make bailouts, that might actually make these countries more beholden to China. But on the other hand, it might make those countries a little bit more resentful. If the one who's lent out to a project that never had any chance of actually generating value. In addition, we document the Chinese state-owned banks and enterprises have extended an additional $70 billion in rescue loans for balance of payments support. In total, China's overseas bailouts correspond to more than 20% of the total IMF lending over the past decade, and bailout payments occurring fast. In essence, China's Belt and Road Initiative, while generating a degree of influence, hasn't always gone exactly how China would want. And if these loans need to continue to be bailed out, then it might not actually generate positive sentiment toward the whole initiative, suggesting this might not actually be as effective as China might otherwise hope. On investment front, China has made significant strides in improving corporate governance and trading rules. Ironically enough, making them more and more similar to what's going on in the United States. However, there are still some issues. For example, we've seen this with China Evergrande or Country Garden, but it is worth noting, of course, that the US still has issues. As for example, Hindenburg has recently alleged against Block. There's also the concerns about malinvestment going on in China, and the concerns about whether China is propping up specific sectors that weren't in the long term able to stand on their own legs. That is, these sectors could survive under the weight of subsidies, but they won't necessarily be able to survive if those subsidies are ultimately removed, which can create unsustainable growth. But of course, the US is doing some similar things, also interfering in the semiconductor industry. So it's not as if China is necessarily out on its own in relation to propping up particular industries. There's also the issue of government intervention in various sectors. For example, there was the tech crackdown. But China intervened in various tech firms who were to give China some credit there. The tech crackdown was not without some merit. For example, a lot of it was targeted at monopolistic practices or at companies that were potentially misusing user data. And that is inherently something that would prefer the government to get on top of, and something that, in fact, the US government has been attempting to do, albeit with not terribly much success. So what do we make of this? China's economy is vibrant, and it's growing, and it's improving all the time. China has improved corporate governance, improved trading rules, and many of these countries are generating genuine innovation. We can see this just, for example, in the energy sector, where there is significant innovation in those sectors, and those companies are growing incredibly rapidly and expanding overseas. However, oftentimes when this is happening, there's actually a degree of convergence, a degree of cooperation between the United States and China. Many companies in the United States are cooperating with companies in China. Tesla, for example, has factories in China. There's cooperation across borders, so these countries are really eating each other alive rather than actually cooperating. However, it's clearly in the best interests of both countries to engage in cooperation and to generate greater total economic growth rather than trying to engage in an acrimonious zero-sum game. Thanks for watching. Until the next one.